Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. So social media, along with Substack, email, all those things will be provided for you. Okay, so I'm going to run through a list of my audio platforms. They're just roughly. And as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I am pushing myself, looking to grow, pushing everything out to where I'm on all of the podcast platforms. So I'm on Audible, Amazon Music, Spotify for podcasters, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Amazon Music, just to name a few. And also, I greatly appreciate all the listeners out there. Feedback is important. If you have questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to me through email. That's the best way to get a quicker response from me. And also, ratings are greatly important. So all the platforms that I briefly listed, please give me a rating on those. It'd be greatly important to help out a lot. All right, so this episode is about the musical styles of Greece, Portugal, and Cambodia. Let's get into it. Okay, so dance. There are two major forms of Cambodian dance, classical and folk, which are both taught under the same roof. At first, the classical form borrowed much from the Indian tradition and earlier folk styles, but with time, this developed into more of a Khmer style. The dancers are accompanied by a pinpet orchestra, which consists of a bamboo xylophone, a flute, a oboe, two-string violin, hand cymbals, gongs, and various drums. During the genocidal rule of Khmer Rouge, however, 90% of all classical performers were killed, along with anyone who had a musical background. Okay, to specify with the musical background is a bourgeois musical background. Cambodian classical music has greatly influenced similar traditions in Thailand and Laos and Burma. All of these can be traced back to the heavenly dancing hundreds of years earlier. Cambodia also has ancient traditions of mass dancing and shadow plays, both of which can be seen throughout the country. Despite the recent bloody history of Cambodia, folk songs and wedding songs are still commonly played. The Cambodian government is currently trying to gather and collect material from old Cambodian folk singers. The popular theater of Cambodia is called the Lecom, believe the pronunciation of that, which is created by Cambodians in Vietnam at the beginning of the 20th century. Here, classical dance and musical styles are popularized and sound at times like the Vietnamese popular opera of the Kai Lulong, believe the pronunciation of that. All right, so to rephrase that again, the Vietnamese popular operatic style, the Kai Long. So Cambodia rocks, the rise of popular music. Let's get into this. Western music entered Cambodia in the middle of the 19th century. French musicians were hired to teach Western music at the palace. This led to written forms of the Khmer music and the setting of Khmer tunes to Western orchestration. After the independence of France in 1953, a golden era for songwriters and singers emerged, which lasted until the 70s. None of the artists from this time survived the murders, but their influence lives on. At the present, local modern styles like the use of the with the electrification of the instruments of the traditional sounds. And in the 1960s, local pop and rock music took off, which traveled to the West in the mid-90s, where Cambodian psychedelic pop/rock influenced the growth of transnational music throughout the Cambodian repertoire. Rembetika began as the music of the Greek urban dispossessed. It has existed in some form since the beginning of the 20th century, but it's difficult to define or get to the origin of jazz or blues, if these are the cases of the foundation of this particular type of music. Rembetika song, it tells of the illicit or frustration of love, drug addiction, police oppression, and death. So along the lines of what I'm interpreting about this, and I'll make more thoughts about this after I've, wrap it up. More of the political and the bagging the terms from film noir, sort of the seediness with the whole, from my point of view, the seediness of the realities of urban life and the realities of the day-to-day factors of what humans can experience. Okay, so, and the delivery tends to be the resignation to the singer's lot, coupled with defiance of authority. And the whole aspects of the singer's lot is referring to me with the biblical sort of lot that you're dealing with, the sort of sin and sort of things of that nature. And it also returns to the mythology of this too, coupled with the defiance of authority. Musically, Rembetika is found with a long neck fruit lute. So, origins of Rembetika, Cafe Amani. At the beginning of the 20th century in Asia Minor cities, and particularly to name one particular city, Istanbul, music cafes became popular. Many of the cafes were owned and staffed by Greeks, Jews, Americans, and even a few gypsies. The cafes usually featured groups consisting of violinists and a vocalist, along with a sandori, I believe the pronunciation of that, player. The songs were improv and became known as Cafe Amain. And Athens and its port developed rapidly. By the early 30s, several key musicians had emerged. For the most part of this, among them was a quartet composing of Batis and Marcos and Artemius just to name a few. They were a remarkable group and is often described as the grandfather of the Rembetika. And his throughout the grainy aspects of this sort of seediness and this sort of realistic aspects, well, coffee shop sort of vibe. There was a German documentary depicting the tavern life about this in the 60s. Quite interesting. So, Rembetika through tough times and post-war. Alright, so the golden age of Rembetika was short-lived. The association of music with the drug-laced underworld would prove its undoing. After the imposition of the puritanical Mexesas dictatorship and in 1936, songs with uncompromising lyrics were censored. So these laws were enforced and police harassment stepped up in Athens. Even the possession of a pagzuski, which is the pagzuski, is along the association of a guitar. Things like this were an offense. Soon after World War II, with the harsh Axis occupations of Greece and the subsequent of the 46 through the 49 Civil War, put everyone's careers on hold. When Greece emerged in the 50s, its public were eager to adopt a softer music and new heroes. The major figure of post-war Rembetika were as follows. Alright, so Vasilis Toussanis. He obligated the traumatized public with love songs and Napoleon melodies. So, alongside folk and Rembetika, post-war Greece developed its own forms of art and pop music. Since the late 70s, the scene has broadened to include roots, mining of rock and fusion experiments, and the new exploration of visiting forms. All right, so on to the Ekreno Revolution. Ekreno, which means to stretch out, the Ekreno music of the late 1950s encompassed an orchestra genre where folk instrument rhythms and melodies would be interwoven into a symphonic fabric. And its first and most famous practitioners were as follows. Okay, so Manos Haderachis and Mikis Theodorakis. Their music combined the Rimbic and the Byzantine influence with the Western ones, but more memorably fused Greek music with the country's rich poetic tradition. Nikos Zelwarkis was a Cretan singer who lent his golden voice to this sound. The endeavors and accompanied himself with the lyra. This is rare. There is a rare clip if you're interested in the source that I will provide for you. On Friday's episode, there's a rare clip of him playing and dancing in a Greek tavern circa 1960. Okay, so Lyco. is termed as son of Rembetika. The dynamic opposed to the musical styles of what I mentioned earlier was the authentic laiko, or popular music of the 1950s and the 1960s. It was a gritty, rough style which was direct heir to the Rembetika. The most influential laiko performer in the 1960s was Stelios Cansadensis, forgive me for the pronunciation, whose volcanic, mournful style was often imitated but never matched. A trio of other rising stars included in this period is George Dolores, Harris Alexou, just to name a few. So as I mentioned about Christy and Stathis, about the pioneers of reinventing folk and the new age, so the 2012 album, let me dive into it. So it's a mix of psychedelic flavor and their music shape shift, twisting and turning their listeners' expectations and plunging in to the depth and a new world of expressions. Their head-turning approach of playing old songs mixed with quirky samples, Christy's vocals, a traditional Greek example of her sound, and an Indian harmony and various frames of drums, and underpinned by live looping, comes as conservatives on the folk scene. So, Christy and Stathis are keen to break away from the preservationists and explore something fresh and, importantly, resulting of the Greek experience. So to add on to what I was saying, it's actually the conservatives of the objecting and having a criticism of bouncing in new and fresh, innovative ways of re-representing folk music in a new era. To each his own, and it's one of those things where it's a good thing to preserve the traditions, but also if it's not harming anybody and it's trying to bring a new light to the traditions and to bring in people of a new era, a new generation to embody Greek folk, the Greek song, Greek music, why not? It's something to consider. But I can see things from both point of view, and I think it's quite interesting. All right, here we go. All right, Rembetika, guitar, and what it is of today. Today, many artists still perform Rembetika repertoire and put their own spin on the historical tradition. Most of the songs of the album date from the 1930s, the creative zenith of the Rembetika, are originally from that's Lonki, the pronunciation of that. Again, forgive me for the pronunciation. It's a work in progress here. And sings with the rough and gravelly vocal tone that sounds older than the years. The album highlights his masterful guitar of this musician's technique and his musician/singer of the tone and the unique aspects that he puts in his music. The album highlights his masterful guitar technique. Hold on, sweetheart, I'll be right there. Technique, and is an important reminder that guitar and not just traditions are the full mask of what this is about. It embodies more and still embraces the traditions, but gives a more of an interlace of undertones in the music. And if you're interested, in the source that I will provide on Friday on Substack, it will have a link to him performing. A YouTube link, that is, to him performing, and the sources that main source that I have that I am quoting from. And then giving, along with quoting from, of course, giving my thoughts and spin on it too. So to add on to my thoughts about the Rembetika music, I think it's quite interesting when you get into the aspects of speaking on and talking about not the subculture, so to speak, and how all these things are interlaced, and how this movement went about with the 30s on to the 50s, and how it dispersed and interlaced itself, and to musicians who want to re-embrace it in a modern sense. And linking this back into the American sense of this, of how in the 60s these psychedelic fringe cultures and bands, particularly psychedelic bands like the Velvet Underground, just for example, how, and singers like Lou Reed, for example, how they tapped in and of the subversive and the whole movement around that, and how that formed an aspect of how they coined it, free expression, and estranged from conventional sort of thinking. And it's quite interesting to see how these aspects are addressed and how they are perceived in other countries. And it's quite interesting when you get down to it, because of the aspect of the freedom of expression. Now, freedom of expression is prideful and is a great privilege that we have in America. And that is something that is hard to come by in a lot of other countries. And to the fact of persecution to a judicial point of view, to where you can be imprisoned for it. And the notion today of the aspect of censoring freedom of expression because of saying, somebody is saying, now I don't agree at all with the submersion of the drug counterculture, talking about things like that, but it's admirable to tap and talk about what you witness and what you see on a day-to-day basis that's not so pretty, and then also being upfront about that. And then it's one of those lines to cross also from another point of view of debauchery and the aspect of does this lead to music that is to counterculture, that is harmful to society, and which we tie it back into many cases of what goes on today in popular music, where it be interlaced with sexualization in pop, where it be the aspects of the thug, gangster, criminal activity of rap, and so forth. And so, needless to say, to rein back into my point is here. Now, we as an Americans shouldn't take that lightly, that freedom of expression is a controlled expression, when it shouldn't be. Freedom of expression is of what it is, that, an expression, and to encourage and listen to other points of views. Now, of course, with common sense, there are points of views that are just objectively not acceptable, and which is, needless to say, something else to think about, how common sense is not a sort of sense of today for the most part. So this is what I'm leaning to. So how is it acceptable to where it's saying being accepted of having children go to drag shows, having the concept of that it's acceptable for minor attractive people to even have a term for it, when these people would be shunned out of society not too long ago, about 10, 15 years ago, and now it's acceptable. It's one of those things that we have to step back and see the aspect and the great notion and the great ideas and which this country was founded on, which the founding fathers were found this country on, and which they escaped England from, to the reality of the situation, to have freedom of expression, freedom of religions, freedom of thought, freedom of the opportunity of vocation. And it's something to treasure and something to not take lightly. And it's unfortunate that it's something that's not a urgent sense to preserve in today's society. Not, it's refreshing that people more and more drove the line of coming back to the reality of the situation of how important it is to preserve the notion of the freedom of the press, freedom of expression, the First Amendment. It's really great and admirable, but there's still those fringes that are speaking louder and still holding on. But it's nice to see that it's us getting there, but it's a slow push, but at least it's getting there. So going back to the Rhythmica and these Greek songs, it's really, something to say about that, speaking on the fringes when it's not in your best interest to do. It's really, really quite courageous to do, and it's really something to think about. And then also along the lines of how I said with the seediness of crossing that line to where, some things just are better left unsaid and not to entertain. But it's nice it's good to know and to understand the history and the background of these types of songs to get a more in-depth analysis and an in-depth interpretation about Greece and different cultures. And within that, I think, gives a better sort of sense of connection and sense of reality of these societies. Alright, so Alentejo. In the southern province of Alentejo, there is a surviving tradition of the polyphonic, usually male, vocal groups. These usually include the position of the ponto, who sings the first couple of verses in alto, a second singer who takes over the theme, singing it a third above the original pitch. After a few notes, the full chorus joins in at the original pitch while the alto sings an ornamental harmony line. Ranchos folklores. Quite a number of villages and towns have folklore and in symbols known as the ranchos folklores. These were encouraged by the dictatorships as the exemplars of the happy, colorful peasantry, and were therefore somewhat disapproved by musicians who were opponents of the regime. These symbols often included accordions and various percussion instruments, singers, and dancers. The fiddle. Despite often being defined simply as fate, the term fado has a deep and complex meaning invested by the Portuguese. Similar in some ways to Greek mbetika, it is a song of harsh reality, traditionally accompanied by classic guitar, the viola, and the guitarra, the Portuguese influence. With its raw passion and elegance, fado is one of the world's great living musical traditions. It's the melody of ranges in the songs about lost love and tragic stories of the sea have a bewitching beauty. Fados, the lifeblood of Portugal's urban folk sing, is a melody songs pumping thick through the Lesbos streets, cobble streets, and steaming port sidebars, piercing the hearts of listeners with typically mournful lyrics and full, heartfelt vocal performances. Hold on, sweetheart, just a minute. Fado origins. There are many theories of fado's origins, including the Portugal maritime history, the hardships of the criminal and working classes of the 19th century, Lisbon, and the Moorish occupation of Portugal in the first millennium. However, many argue that fado continues influences from Portugal's African and South American colonial empire, with traces of traditional dance music such as the folfai and so on, and also a strong hint of Portugal's poetic and literary legacy. The most popular, thought somewhat mythologicalized story concerning early fado concerns Maria Saravia, a prostitute who had an affair with a well-known count. After the affair ended due to the disapproval of his family, and it is said she began to sing the fado to express her heartache before dying in her mid-20s. Fado is of this sort can still be heard in certain parts of Lisbon, but the locations are increasingly hard to find. More often than not, these sessions take place away from the usual tourist restaurants and tend to be in the late afternoon/early evening. They do, however, offer a great insight into the function of fado for the average Portuguese person rather than serving as mere entertainment. And I will get into the aspects of the singers of fado music and on Friday. Okay, so new songs and modern fusions. In the second half of the 20th century, in particular the years following the fall of the Portuguese dictatorship of 74, fado, combined with other influences such as folk, rock, Latin American music, formed a new style of new songs. Jose Afonso. The giant of the 20th century the Portuguese popular and roots music was Jose Afonso. During the years and through the 1974, he was the leading figure in the reinstitution of the ballad, in the sense of a set of artistic, poetic, usually contemporary lyrics set to music. His evolving musical framework drew on regional tradition music and fado, and provided to be a much-needed rallying point for both the development of new music, but also for the democraticized, or it's more of a democratic sort of aspect of politics of the state. It helped songwriters move from protesting under oppression to exploring the need and possibilities of the new democracy. Roots and groups. In the 70s, groups began to form, which devoted their attention once again to the traditional regional music or to the construction of new music with folk roots. This is often seen as an important aspect of self-rediscovery and a new democracy, rather than the quest for ruralism at the heart of other folk revivalists, while the ranchos folklores were sometimes seen as leftovers from the dictatorship. These new groups were closer to the spirit of the Nueva Canacao. Today's leading traditional roots groups include Brigida Victoria Jara, one of the early post-revolutionary groups, via the Roda de Rio. All have moved on to a more detailed exploration of sounds and possibilities for the development than that which prevailed in the first wave. Other groups and artists remain closer to the spirit of fado, which these groups for instance, one example, Los Pontes. Alright, so this reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in, turn up, and let's get on to those charted waters out there. Take care.